Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. I'm Jacob Kyle, and today I sit down with James D. Reich for a conversation about religion as vortex, poetic manifestation, and the work of aesthetic thinkers of medieval Kashmir, particularly my favorite, Abhinavagupta. At the heart of our discussion today is something that I find deeply interesting and that very much connects to the topic of our upcoming spring sadhana at Embodied Philosophy, which is oriented around the role of the spectator in experiencing rasa. In Indian aesthetic theory, rasa is initially spoken about historically in relation to the artist or the poet or the performer. In other words, rasa is something that the performer crafts in order for others to savor. So the rasa is on the side of the performer. But rasa is not a one-way transmission, according to later thinkers. It is not something that is simply given, but it's something that is evoked and perhaps even awakened. So then the reader or the spectator of a work of art, like the audience of a theatrical piece, the audience participates in the unfolding of this aesthetic experience called rasa through their own cultivated sensitivity and their own capacity for immersion, recognition, and transformation. And so this shift from thinking of rasa as something that's produced to something that's experienced has really interesting implications, not only for how we approach aesthetics, literature, and our philosophy of art, but also for how we understand meditation and contemplative practice. Indeed, one could see meditation as an inner kind of performance that we do in a way to cultivate rasa. As we explore in our upcoming rasa theory sadhana, the meditator is not merely an observer of experience, but becomes an active participant in the cultivation of that experience. So just as a reader must attune themselves to the nuances of a text, the meditator cultivates a heightened receptivity to the somatic and sensorial textures of experience, allowing rasa to arise, not just as an intellectual concept, but as a lived, felt, affective reality. So James and I don't take this discussion as far as making the connection to meditation. That's what I plan to do in our upcoming sadhana. But we do explore this topic primarily through the history and philosophy of aesthetics in medieval Kashmir, which is also the topic of James's book, To Savor the Meaning, the Theology of Literary Emotions in Medieval Kashmir. While the conversation, I think, is pretty wide-ranging, it does at times veer towards the somewhat academic, but nevertheless, you will be introduced to the perspectives of some exciting thinkers that perhaps you haven't learned much about before. If you are interested in learning more about our spring sadhana exploring rasa theory, just head to embodiedphilosophy.com and click on the link at the top of the homepage. You'll see it as a little banner there at the top of the page. If you're listening to this sometime after mid-2025, don't worry, all of our sadhanas are made on demand, so you can still watch those recordings of this sadhana by searching our course library at embodiedphilosophy.com. So with that, let's go ahead and get into today's interview with James D. Reich. I hope you enjoy the episode.
I did my PhD at Harvard, where you have to do a master's before you start the PhD. So I started out doing a master's at Harvard, a freestanding master's. And at that point, I knew nothing about Kashmir. I mean, I sort of knew where it was on the map, and I'd heard of it, but I didn't know anything about anything, really. I mean, I didn't know anything about anything. I was interested in Buddhism. And I was interested in Tibet and India, and I was sort of interested in the translation of Buddhism across cultural divides, because I thought that was maybe similar to what was going on now. And I took a course with Anne Monius on Indian aesthetics, and kind of had my mind blown, and wrote a final research paper for her on Abhinavagupta, which was the very first kind of glimmering of this project. And then I still didn't know necessarily that I wanted to do Kashmiri stuff. And I applied to a bunch of PhD programs, and I was told by my advisor, Parimal Patil, just make up a project that sounds doable. Like you're not stuck to it. You don't have to do it, but like just make something up. And then this is like an important lesson for me in my life, in like the value of pretension, because I just made something up and then it actually turned out to be like a pretty good idea, and I kind of stuck with it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't remember
You
exactly.
ended up with the same idea you started with. That's pretty great.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't exactly, but it had to do with like the role of Bhartrhari, this grammatical philosopher Bhartrhari in Kashmir, and his adoption by various people or rejection by various people. That was like what I was like, okay, I'll just do that. And then as my program went on, I started centering more and more around that, and thought like, yeah, that is what I really want to do. And that combined with the Abhinavagupta stuff, and I mean, I can give you more of a detailed history of how the project came about, but that's like, kind of how it grew.
Yeah, that's wonderful that like the seed of that initial kind of interest blossomed into something that you actually stuck with. I mean, I've heard a lot of kind of horror stories about at Oxford there was someone who had started his whole project was based on this one text, and then it had never received any treatment at all by any other scholars, and then realized 2 years in that it was like ridiculously impossible to complete a project on it. So he kind of did a complete 180, which is a little bit refreshing to know that, in the PhD, you can sort of like regroup and, channel your interests in another direction. Like it's not the end of the world if you have to switch gears.
Definitely.
That probably helps if you don't have to.
Yeah, my advisor is Parimal Patil. I also worked closely with Anne Monius, who is a mentor of mine. And she told me once, when I was doing my dissertation prospectus, she said two things that were really interesting. One thing was, if the dissertation winds up looking too much like the prospectus, something has gone wrong. Like there should be an evolution and a transformation of ideas as you work on it. The other thing she told me was, when you're trying to figure out what topic to pick, one way to think about it is, what do you want to be absolutely sick of 8 years from now?
That makes a lot of sense
about it, but yeah.
Well, are you sick of the theology of literary emotions in medieval Kashmir?
No, I'm not. I'm not sick of it. But when the book came out, I did pivot and start working on other things, because I did need to get away from it for a little while. So I have like other projects that I sort of got into that haven't come to fruition yet, but we're very far from that. Because, I wasn't sick of it so much, but like listeners of yours who've written a book will know, or who are going to write a book will find out. After the book came out, if I would do research on these exact topics, I would just start re-adjudicating all the decisions I made in the book. Like,
oh my gosh, I know, yeah.
And so I just needed to like pick something totally different for a little while.
Right, because you're just constantly being like, it needs a second edition because I should have included this. Yeah.
Yeah, because
that makes a lot of sense.
Genuine intellectual work's never finished, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably for the best anyway. It shows a little bit of, ongoing intellectual humility to be able to be responsive to your own work in that way, rather than, thinking that the PhD was kind of the golden egg. Okay, so let's talk about this. I'm not going to put you through the ringer of trying to make you recapitulate all the arguments you wrote in this book. And also, I don't think it would be particularly kind to listeners to do that, because, as we said, it's, the emergent property of your PhD research. And also, we haven't really explored this range of topics before on the podcast. We've done a lot of, obviously, yoga philosophy types of things over the years, and most of the students will be kind of or the listeners, I should say, are going to be kind of intellectually curious meditation yoga practitioners, certainly open-minded and like the deep stuff, but certain things we haven't explored so much, and one of them I've been wanting to do more is the Rasa theory and kind of the unique traditions of aesthetics that we find in the Indian tradition or the South Asian tradition. So to be kind to the listeners, I thought we could sort of do some broad strokes and kind of talk about a little bit of the context of the aesthetic tradition, how it transformed, and then maybe get a little bit into sort of the general disagreements between the Abhinavagupta, Anandavardhana on the one hand, and Mahimabata, the other thinker that you explore in your book. Since I haven't mentioned it already, those of you who are listening, I am speaking with James D. Reich. I hope I'm pronouncing Reich
that's fine.
correctly.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's fine. Is there another pronunciation?
My family usually says Reich, but yours is actually the more correct pronunciation. So,
Right. Is that because of historical associations?
I have no idea what it's because of, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, James D. Reich, or Reich, is the author of To Savor the Meaning, the Theology of Literary Emotions in Medieval Kashmir. A beautiful book for those who want to explore some of the intellectual history of this period as it relates both to some philosophical theology of Kashmir Shaivism as well as the traditions of aesthetics. And as we'll discover, they're not so easily hermetically or independently conceived. There's an overlap that I'm sure James will talk about. So, James, to begin with, let's just talk a little bit about, before we talk about Rasa, I'd like to talk about this way in which, at the beginning of the book, you invite the reader to kind of reconceptualize religion around this very exciting term, vortex.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love a vortex? So you say that you kind of go over several pages talking about how we should think about religion as a vortex. And so I wanted you to just unpack this a little bit for us and tell us how this approach to seeing religion as a vortex is different from other definitions of religion, and how those alternative definitions are perhaps obstacles to really understanding what we're going to be talking about.
Sure. One thing that was important to me writing the book is that I'm kind of a nominalist about religion. That is to say, like it's our category. It's a hermeneutic category that we use to organize the world. I don't think there is a right or wrong definition of religion. There are useful or unuseful definitions. So for this project, I wanted to come up with a definition that would allow me to do what I needed to do, which is show connections between things that didn't seem to be connected, namely ideas about poetry and why it's beautiful, and ideas about God, to put it simply. And I did. So I wanted to argue. I do believe that these literary theories are tied up in religion. But not in a kind of crude or straightforward way. There's like a more subtle way of describing the relationship. And religion as vortex came about as a way of trying to describe what I actually meant when I say these literary theories are religious. So the idea is that what we commonly refer to when we say religion is a set of relationships between something that is considered to be of ultimate importance, something beyond which there is nothing. You could call that God. You could call that nirvana. The content is not as important as like this is the central, most important thing. And then that thing will sort of arrange aspects of life around it, or aspects of life will become arranged around that. And what I'm interested in is not so much the ultimate itself, but the relationship between that ultimate and other aspects of life, and the relationship between or among other aspects of life within that vortex. So it's a way of thinking about religion as a set of relationships rather than one single thing. And those relationships are sometimes very strong and clear, which is, so at the center of a vortex, things are spinning very quickly. Sometimes it's very tenuous and unclear, so way at the edges of a hurricane, there might only be a little bit of rain and wind. But that rain and wind is being affected by this larger structure. And I found it helpful to think about religion as a kind of set of relationships and set of influences, which the idea of a vortex kind of Once I got it stuck in my head, I sort of couldn't get it out of my head. And then after a while, I was like, okay, I guess I should put that in the, if I can't stop thinking about it, I guess I should probably put it in the book.
I mean, I like it. I think it's a really useful way of thinking about it. I'm curious, though, how do you see this, the kind of conceptual work that Vortex does for us, different from just speaking about like a religious worldview?
Religious worldview, it wouldn't be so bad to think about it as a religious worldview. It just, it makes it seem, first of all, like there's a clear distinction between what's religious and what's not. And it also, just see if I can gather my thoughts here. The poetry in question, the literary theory in question, is not necessarily directly a religious issue. So religion as vortex allows for lines of influence that may not be totally clear at all times, but can be found or discovered. You can sort of show, like, look, this is in a religious vortex. Whereas religious worldview kind of makes it seem like it's either there or isn't. It's either called a religious, capital R, religious issue, or it's therefore not a religious issue at all. It's more, I think, a matter of emphasis than anything else. I just find it more useful to think in terms of vortex. I don't think religious worldview, I wouldn't say like that's the wrong way to think about it. I just think it doesn't quite bring out what I'm trying to show.
Yeah, and I think what also kind of stood out to me was the way in which the image of the vortex sort of it evokes a sense of kind of towards the center. There's sort of a more kind of intensity or a kind of gravity in a certain kind of sense toward this kind of the center of that vortex. We're out towards the periphery. There's slightly, it's more peripheral. There's less intensity around, but there's some kind of subtle relationship.
Yeah, it allows for
all right,
of influence.
Yeah. So there's a transformation, right, of literary theory connected to this concept of Rasa Dhvani in the work of Anandavardhana that happens in and around the 9th century that you explore. That kind of is towards the beginning of your book. Can you briefly describe what the theory of rasa is and how it transformed, or Dhvani, maybe that's better to focus on, and how it transformed the tradition of Indian aesthetics that came prior?
Sure. Yeah. I can talk briefly about both. I mean, rasa, for listeners who don't know this term, rasa literally means kind of sap or juice or taste, and it's used in Indian theory to describe the emotional essence of a scene or of a poem or of something literary. And they're usually lists of primary rasas, like there are primary colors or primary emotions. There's either 8 or 9, and they include things like the erotic, the heroic, but also things like the disgusting and the fearful and the amazing and things like this. So the idea is you can write a scene for a play or a poem that has a kind of emotional essence or sap at the core of it. And this is a very old idea. It goes back to, we don't know how far back it goes, but it goes back very far, much before Anandavardhana. And it's not so much a theory in itself as it is a kind of like pole star for theories. So people will you can articulate different literary theories by trying to come up with your explanation of like what exactly rasa is. How's it different from ordinary emotions? Where is it located? Is it located in the scene? Is it located in the spectator? Is it located in the character? Is it a transformation of other types of emotions? Is it totally separate from them? These are all like questions that are raised by rasa that then theorists try to answer. And one kind of interesting thing that I really like about rasa as a concept that I think often gets overlooked, if you look at a very early text on dramaturgy called the Natya Shastra, there's a list somewhere in there of actions that are forbidden to be portrayed on stage. And they're mostly like very, very personal bodily function type actions. So sex, sleep, eating, things like that you can't portray directly on the stage.
Excreting, perhaps.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, I don't remember the list off the top of my head, but I would guess that that's there. But eating is on the list. And rasa is an eating metaphor. You're tasting it with your tongue. So it's actually like a very, very intimate, almost kind of like private relationship that you also somehow share with all the spectators. This is kind of a cool way to think about what's going on when you read a poem. So Anandavardhana, this theorist in the 9th century, he comes up with his explanation for what rasa is and how it comes to be. And his explanation has to do with this mechanism that he claims is the essence of all good poetry, but which hasn't been described before, which he calls, the way I translate it, is poetic manifestation. And there are a couple terms for this. Dhvani is one. I don't want to get your readers too lost in the weeds here, but there are generally two terms associated with Anandavardhana, Dhvani and Vyanjana. And it's a little tricky because they're sometimes treated as synonyms, although they're not. Anandavardhana actually does not use the term Vyanjana ever himself. He uses related terms like Vyanjakatva. But the idea is basically this. The idea is that poetry has the ability to say things directly, but also has the ability to evoke things indirectly. And this relationship of evocativeness between the words or gestures or scenes of a poem or play and the meaning that's being evoked, this is like the relationship between, one metaphor he uses is like a lamp illuminating a pot. It's not creating it, but it's kind of illuminating it without being part of it necessarily, if that makes sense. The name that he chooses for this type of poetry is Dhvani, which he claims to get from a philosopher, grammarian named Bhartrhari. And I'm trying to think of how to do this without getting really too much in the weeds, but the idea in Bhartrhari uses the same idea to talk about what happens when we speak sounds. So like you're listening to me speak right now, and what you're hearing is a string of syllables. But that string of syllables is evoking something. And that something has to do with how you understand what I'm saying. And for Bhartrhari, this is a very tricky idea. Bhartrhari is a very tricky philosopher, but the string of syllables that you're speaking is evoking words, which are kind of like abstract entities that seem like they have divisions. So when I say the word antelope, that seems like the word antelope is divided into parts, but what Bhartrhari says is actually the word is a kind of unified, holistic symbol, and the sounds that I speak are just the way that the only way that unified symbol can take form in the world of appearance, the only way I can communicate it to you. So the sounds of speech that I speak, which are called Dhvani, which means sound or resonance, they evoke or manifest or shine on this abstract thing, which is a word, or if you like, you could think maybe in terms of like the grammatical structures of a language. And this whole relationship of like spoken sounds and words and grammatical entities that are evoked, Anandavardhana imports that into poetry and says that's basically how poetry works. And for that reason, we're going to call poetry that evokes its meanings, we're going to call it Dhvani. And the thing that makes it Dhvani is that it doesn't have an ordinary literal linguistic relationship with its meanings, the way like the word dog has with the category of dog or cow or car or whatever. It has this evocatory relationship that's similar to how the sounds of speech work. So what's important about him, I think, is that he comes up with a way of explaining why it is that the most important things in poetry always have to appear in some other form that they aren't actually. This is an older issue in Sanskrit literary theory. The issue is like, why can't you, the issue is that you're not supposed to name the rasa in a scene. So like, if I just say, she felt very sad and it was really sad, that kind of spoils the mood of the poem. It has to be somehow indirect. Why does it have to be indirect? What Anandavardhana says is that a rasa, or what he implies by his theory, is that just like language, which has to appear externally as spoken sounds in sequence, the mood of a poem has to appear as words and ideas and gestures and plot, none of which is itself the rasa. Now, poetry can evoke things other than rasa. He leaves it open. So you can evoke rhetorical figures, you can hint at plot facts, but rasa is really the most important thing for him. And the thing that I think is important about his theory for the thinkers that I discuss is this whole idea that meanings have to change in appearance in order to be communicated to other people through a poem. I don't know how much of that makes sense. You can ask me to clarify if any of that's unclear.
Well, so I guess maybe, so if I understand correctly, then the kind of, and what I kind of personally understand, such as it is of the type of poetry that's being essentially kind of favored here, or rather what the essence of poetry he's claiming is this like almost like epiphenomenal mood or a certain kind of temperament, a vibe, as it were, that is not reducible to its set of parts that actually that it's comprised of, which I guess is, if we think about just the way people feel about poetry generally today, right? Like people are like, oh, it doesn't make any sense. And because there's almost like this lack of an ability to that's why I think this theory almost like it gives you, obviously I'm speaking about modern kind of poetic connoisseurs, but it does give you a way in which you can sort of understand the point of a poem, that there is this sort of sense in which something happens as a result of just letting these words wash over you or reading them in a particular text that produces this kind of understanding that is not the type of understanding that we typically associate with, discursive argument or the points of a plot.
I think that's putting it very well. The only difference, which I think was a significant one to Anandavardhana, is that with modern poetry and a lot of things like that, you have the phenomenon that I think is very important to people to be able to say, like, it feels beautiful or it feels sad, but I can't exactly say why. Like, I couldn't tell you why this is so scary or why this is so lovely. I just feel it. Right? I can't put it into words. I just feel it. And for Anandavardhana, it's extremely important to him that you be able to see, that he says you can say exactly how it happens. Like we can describe the mechanisms. There's a metaphor that circulates throughout a lot of Sanskrit philosophy of an expert jeweler who is so experienced with gemstones that they just know when a gemstone is fake or genuine, but they can't exactly explain why. They have this like trained intuition, and they say like, I know this is fake. I can't really like prove it or explain why, but I know it's fake, and you just have to trust the jeweler. Anandavardhana says poetry is not like that. That is not how poetry works. You can explain how it unfolds, which I think is different than a lot of modern habits of reading poetry.
Interesting. Okay, so then whose fault is it? Whose fault is it if the rasa of the poem or the work of art is not experienced by the reader?
Well, it could be multiple people's fault. It could be that you have a bad poet. Well, it's either that you have a bad poet or you have a bad audience. For all these guys, Anandavardhana, Abhinavagupta, Mahimabata, you need to be trained. You need to be the proper type of reader to really get the rasa. It's not the kind of thing that happens to everybody, and it's not the kind of thing that happens casually. You have to be like a real connoisseur to get it. So if you're not getting it, you can always blame it on the poet, because it's possible that it's the poet's fault, or it's possible that it's your fault. You're too thick or insensitive, or your heart is too dry, or whatever.
You haven't refined your aesthetic sensibilities enough.
Yeah, as Abhinavagupta likes to say, you haven't polished the mirror of your heart so that it reflects clearly what's in the poem.
Well, I want to come back to that, but maybe let's talk a little bit now about how Abhinavagupta kind of advances or adds to the development of Rasa and Dhvani. So what is unique about Abhinavagupta's contribution here?
Well, so Abhinavagupta, okay, so the theory of Dhvani sort of goes on to become canonical in Indian history. Everybody sort of pays lip service to it, takes it for granted that that's there were a few attempts to argue against it, one of which I deal with in the book, but they all basically lost the battle of ideas, and Dhvani goes on to become the main theory. But the theory that goes on to become the main one is really Abhinavagupta's version of the theory. He's like this commentator who kind of overshadows the original that he's commenting on, which he did a lot, actually.
Poor guys.
So Abhinavagupta is a very, very interesting, prolific, unusual guy. He was a religious authority figure. He was a tantric scholar. He was a philosopher. And he was also very into literary theory. And he makes a lot of changes in the theory, but to sort of sum them up or simplify them, one thing that he does is he conflates more closely the idea of vyakti, first of all, he coins the term vyanjana, as far as we can tell. He's the one who makes up this term vyanjana, and he equates it with Dhvani. So the equation between these two terms, it really comes from Abhinavagupta. And he also is much more into reader response theory. So now, rather than poetry just kind of evoking rasa in some abstract way, what it's doing is it's stimulating rasa in your heart. And the way that it does that is basically by stimulating your own emotional memories, which can come from past lives, but it strips them of your own personal associations. So you're no longer feeling like, I'm sad because of that person who broke my heart 10 years ago. You just feel the sadness itself, and the sadness itself, stripped of personal associations, is pleasurable, oddly. And there's an elaborate theological reason why Abhinavagupta thinks that is pleasurable. It has to do with his ideas about the nature of the mind and the nature of the universe and the nature of Shiva. And in my reading of it, his entire literary theory is very, very deeply religious because it can't be understood apart from his theology. But yeah, those are the main things that he does. Is he sort of tries to explain rasa as an experience that the spectator undergoes that is evoked in Anandavardhana's terms, in the sense that it is stimulated in your heart.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, this is where I think people get really excited about kind of the implications of this work and how much it feels. Everybody, lots of most popular non-scholarly folks like to know how it can enrich and influence their kind of modern understandings of things. And I think that there's so much that's kind of transferable about this. I mean, even when you were saying like experiencing the sadness without actually like being attached to the object of sadness. I mean, there's so much that comes up in kind of modern mindfulness discourse around, around that. And it's just, you kind of wonder sort of how much of that sort of derives in some sense, in some subtle threads of history back to that.
Yeah. I mean, Abhinavagupta is also, his theories are also, as far as I can, I mean, you should never make sweeping statements like this because I haven't read everything, but they're the best theories that I've found from South Asia that explain why it would be that pain can sometimes be pleasurable. And this was, the significance of this philosophically was really pointed out to me by Kat Pruitt at University of British Columbia, who's a philosopher who also works on Abhinavagupta. But I think she's right. This is like really, really interesting theory of how it is that pain can be pleasurable if you savor it in the right way, which is true. I think everybody's familiar with pain that can be pleasurable. But
yeah, I mean, for me, where I really connected with this was through fear because I love horror.
Right.
And I'm always trying to explain to people like why I love horror. And I'm like, it is, to actually be able to watch this and the thrill of like going on a roller coaster of fear in this way is pleasurable in this kind of obscene way.
Yeah. Or even like an incredibly sad story. This is kind of a puzzle that like literary theorists all over the world, in ancient Greece, in contemporary Europe, and in India, they all have to deal with. It's like, why do people like indulging in these things that seem like they would be unpleasant, but people like them? This is like eternal puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely.
You love watching a love
there's
story.
A lot of...
you want to watch a love story that would be terrible if it happened to you or to your best friend because it's a sad love story, but you love watching it,
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I suppose, someone could read this if they wanted to in a sort of like secular way. But of course, Abhinavagupta, as you say, and I really appreciated this point in your book because I share this perspective, is that we can't really hermetically seal off his so-called, aesthetics from, or his literary theory from his, philosophical theology. You put it this way, I'll read something that you wrote. When Abhinavagupta transformed literary theory by grounding the theory of poetic manifestation in Shaiva theology, he likewise transformed Shaiva theology in the process. His theology is just as aestheticized as his aesthetics is theological, and rather than arbitrarily treating one as conceptually prior, it would be more accurate to say that they were co-emergent, crystallizing together around a core set of metaphysical concerns that fascinated Abhinavagupta throughout his life, end quote. So basically, it's not the chicken or the egg, it's both. So right. What kind of misunderstandings do you think follow from seeing some kind of, genetic origin in one way or another, from his aesthetics to his theology or from his theology to his aesthetics?
I think it just gives you a more crude picture of who he was as a person, and how thinking works. Like, I think that it makes it sound like he was sort of calculating, and he sort of thought like, well, I have this theology, so I need to figure out some way to explain literary theory that fits with that. Otherwise, I'll be embarrassed because it'll turn out my theology's wrong, right? Or he says, or the other way around. Like it makes it seem. It impoverishes our vision of what an intellectual's life work is, which is that they have a set of deep intuitions that are stable across things that they think about and take seriously. And Abhinavagupta, I mean, this is why sometimes he's called a polymath because he did so many different things, but I don't like to call him a polymath. Because he really only did a very limited set of things. He just did those things in the realm of theory, in the realm of theology, in the realm of tantra, in the realm of philosophy, right?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how the aesthetics and the soteriology or the theology overlap. I mean, I know it's a huge topic. It's like would take hours and hours and hours, if not days. But maybe you can just give us the highlights, the greatest hits of the overlap and correspondences between the two domains of his work.
Sure. So Abhinavagupta is a non-dualist, which is to say he thinks that all divisions in the universe are not ultimately real. And he's a monist. Well, he's a non-dualist and he's a monist. Those are kind of the same thing. And he is an idealist, which means he thinks that mind is primary, comes before matter. So he comes up with this kind of vision of the entire universe. It is this one mind, which is called Shiva. And that mind playfully divides itself up into the world that we encounter, where things seem different from each other. You seem different from me. My chair seems different from my couch, whatever. And that is sort of Shiva's one mind, like dividing itself up into appearances. That's kind of his like basic view of how the universe works. Now, Shiva for him is self-aware. This is very important. Shiva is not just awareness, but awareness that can interact with itself. And Shiva is also blissful. And in Abhinavagupta's theology, bliss is the what's the word I'm looking for? The kind of like de facto default mode of the mind. Pain enters in when he defines pain as a felt sense of lack in one way or another. When you feel yourself to be lacking something, that's the origin of pain. And because Shiva is aware of himself as all things, Shiva is ultimately blissful. There's no room for pain. But when Shiva divides himself, you kind of think of Shiva like Shiva plays hide and seek with himself. He like hides as us, and then we feel ourselves to be limited, and we lack. I don't know about you, but I could think of a list of things that I would like to have that I don't have, and that's kind of like painful. And so what I'm driving at basically is that what literature does for Abhinavagupta is it produces pleasure because it causes us to reflect in a way where we let go of objects and simply feel the fullness of our own emotions. And that kind of mimics Shiva's self-reflective bliss. So in other words, it puts us in touch with a level of subjectivity underneath our ordinary, limited, divided self. And that, if you don't have Abhinavagupta's theology in mind, it will become sort of puzzling, like, well, why should that be pleasurable? Simply to feel yourself feeling an emotion. But it's pleasurable because ultimately we are Shiva, and that takes us one step further towards Shiva's kind of eternal self-reflective bliss. The other thing I'll say, that's a shorter highlight, is that unlike, for example, Advaita Vedanta, which is a similar non-dual monism, Advaita Vedanta usually understands the appearances of the world as pure illusions. For Abhinavagupta, they're not pure illusions, they are the deliberate creations of Shiva, who is dividing himself up. So they're this is called abhasavada. They're kind of like they're real insofar as we experience them. He doesn't have this thing like illusions are all totally fake, and that gives him room to play in his literary theory with the poem is kind of real in a way. The poem is a real instantiation of a mood, and he has this kind of analogy deep in his work of the mood and experience of a poet taking on form as the poem, sort of like crystallizing into the form of the poem, and then being, you could say, like remelted into liquid in your heart. So it's this kind of like transference. And that kind of lines up for him with God turning himself into the world, and then the religious adept in that world recognizing that it's all Shiva and experiencing the bliss at the core of it. It is kind of like deep analogy for him, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that is so kind of refreshing, I suppose, is one word for it, is how much this kind of embrace of the emotions, or kind of an affirmative connection with the rasas, or the literary emotions, these kind of spiritual emotions, if you want to be crude about it, is very much in contrast. I mean, a little bit like you're saying with regards to kind of illusion, but certainly by contrast to, like, certain ancient Greek philosophers who thought that the emotions were, the realm of the passions, and, we need to kind of settle them or eradicate them in some way so we can abide in some sort of equanimous state of reason.
Yeah.
And then even within...
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, and then in classical Sankhya, classical yoga, we see obviously a more dualistic sense of Purusha trying to extract itself from Prakriti, abiding in consciousness, which is, outside or apart from, independent of Prakriti, which is where all the emotions are. So here we have, and obviously that doesn't work for our modern world. Nobody really wants to live that way. Well, maybe some renunciants do, but most people are trying to find some way to kind of make peace with their emotions. And it turns out that emotions can induce peace, according to this kind of way of thinking. So, yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Well, what I was going to say is that he gets that from Tantra. That's a Tantric idea. And it's here that you see his background as, I mean, he was a Tantric adept. He did a lot of Tantric ritual. He wrote on Tantric ritual. And Tantra is really the place in Indian religion and philosophy where you see deep spiritual value accorded to things that lots of other high-flown religious philosophies around the world tend to devalue, like sex or emotion, or things that seem dirty or transgressive.
Is there any discussion of how you would kind of determine whether or not you are experiencing rasa versus just an ordinary emotion? Like, I mean, I imagine someone could kind of hear this and think, well, it just sounds like all emotions are divine, and therefore there is no kind of way to discern between, my everyday life of dissatisfaction and complicated emotions and the, some sort of divine blissful state.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, if you're not enjoying it, that's one clear sign. If you're in pain. But well, first of all, I just want to be clear, like, rasa for Abhinavagupta is not literally the same as, like, full enlightenment, right? He distinguishes between levels of this. And the hierarchy, like, it goes from ordinary pleasures to rasa is like the highest possible form of pleasure you can have without getting into, like, recognizing yourself as Shiva or getting enlightened or whatever. That hierarchy has to do with how much you're willing to let go of objects and experience the emotion itself in the absence of the objects that it seems to be about. So in other words, like, when you're really angry at someone, if you're focused on them and what they did, that's, for Abhinavagupta, that is not as pleasurable or as spiritually valuable as letting go of them and feeling the emotion itself. It's the letting go of objects that really makes the difference in ordinary emotions and rasa, or tantric religious emotions.
So we're already kind of speaking about this, but I wanted to kind of speak more directly about ethics and see what you have to say about it, if anything. You write on page 19, I believe, literature is ethically valuable because the pleasure it gives the connoisseur is itself the goal toward which a proper life should lead. In other words, taking pleasure in literature is itself an ethical experience. So I just wanted to ask about this idea of rasa as an intrinsic ethical good. What does that mean, And how does he justify that perspective?
It's justified religiously. It's justified with respect to this view of what we really are, which is we really are Shiva, and we really are everything. We lack nothing. We are a kind of eternal, transpersonal, active, blissful subjectivity. And the closer we get to that, the better. And so rasa is ethical because it participates in that dynamic. The goal of life for Abhinavagupta is to move closer to that dynamic, and rasa moves us closer to that dynamic. There's another element to this, but I just want to check that makes sense before I...
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So there's that element of the ethics, that it feels, it is itself valuable because it partakes in this Shiva dynamic. But rasa is also valuable for Abhinavagupta because it provides ethical lessons about how to be in the world. And I have a kind of long section at the end of chapter 3 where I try to explain this, and I draw a lot on the work of a very brilliant Italian scholar named Daniele Cuneo. But the idea for Abhinavagupta is that Shiva's transpersonal subjectivity is never just completely isolated. It's always taking form as the world. And what you want to do as a person is train yourself to find that subjectivity in the world. But it manifests in different ways. And so, like, the ethical education that such and such a set of events is sad, or such and such a set of events is funny, or such and such a set of events is inappropriate, right? That's all a kind of training in what rasa to find in a scene, but it's also a training in a kind of what we would ordinarily recognize as ethics, which is like, how do you behave in the world? And that's where the kind of abstract enlightenment stuff lines up with like actual behavioral stuff about how should a person behave in the world. Okay, so just to finish that thought, I think you can relate to this kind of ethical education if you think about what it feels like when you're watching like what feels like a really serious or upsetting movie and someone laughs at it, right? Or vice versa, like when you're watching something you think is really funny and your friend doesn't laugh at it and you're kind of bummed, right? Like, because there's this kind of breach between the two of you in terms of how you think the world should be. So this kind of the ethics of rasa is not merely like leaving the world behind and finding transpersonal subjectivity. It is also finding the right way to relate to situations in the world. What to find funny, what to find sad, etc. And that will lead down the line, like that does eventually lead people, Abhinavagupta thinks, to be better people. But it isn't itself necessarily about being a better person. It's more about, like, Daniele Cuneo calls it an affective education.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where there's a kind of difference in opinion that you explore, because it seems like the status of this kind of ethical formation, there's something intrinsically ethically formative about literature, about art, aesthetics for Abhinavagupta, whereas this other figure who you explore, Mahimabata, disagrees with Abhinavagupta on this point. So I'll just read one quote and then ask you to maybe unpack his position a little bit for us. So just summarizing this point that I'm mentioning, whereas for Abhinavagupta, the pleasure produced by literature is valuable in and of itself, for a Mahimabata, literature can only be valuable if the pleasure it produces is instrumentally related to ethical goals that are separate from it. So can you talk about his position, and then I'll ask you kind of how he used Buddhist ideas to flesh it out.
Sure, yeah. This is an old idea in South Asian theory. It's one Abhinavagupta was familiar with. Mahimabata did not invent it. there's a kind of a long-standing battle in this tradition between like, is literature for ethical instruction, and the pleasure is just kind of like what the idea is, like the sugar coating on bitter medicine. Like, I could just lecture you on right and wrong, but you'd get really bored, so I have to jazz it up with this story about a pretty girl and a handsome guy, etc. Or is literature really about pleasure? One of the things you can understand Abhinavagupta doing is trying to synthesize those two positions, which is something he often does. Mahimabata just opts for the former very clearly. It's the sugarcoating on bitter medicine thing. And it's a very common idea in South Asian literature. I think that you can see certain poets trying to enact this. So if you read this Buddhist poet Ashvaghosha, for example, there are like long chapters of very, very dry philosophy. And it seems like he's trying to sneak those in while he has your attention with like a story that involves a lot of beauty and sex and things like that. I think Ashvaghosha is actually doing something more sophisticated than that, but he is doing that. And this is Mahimabata kind of takes this view, which I don't personally find as compelling literary theoretically, although I do find it very useful pedagogically. Like, I do, throw in jokes in the classroom just to keep my students' attention. Like, I'll do that kind of thing. But I do think that literature is capable of more than that. But Mahimabata's theory doesn't have room for that, really.
So you were saying that Abhinavagupta kind of resolves these two perspectives. He answers to both concerns, positions. How does he? I mean, I can understand how, based on the theology and how kind of the Rasas connect to that, and the way in which they cultivate an experience of the self or help to facilitate that experience. I can understand the sort of argument of intrinsic value based on that positioning, but how is he also embracing the view that it's also, sweets to, what did you call it? Sweet coating for a sour medicine?
Sugar coating. Well, he doesn't think it's sugar coating on bitter medicine per se, but what he says is the sugar is the medicine. So, in other words, just what I was saying before, like,
right.
Finding the right thing funny and enjoying its funniness, like the pleasure in that is not separable from the ethical ideas you have, right? I mean, like, imagine something that really isn't funny. Like, imagine a video of someone really getting hurt and someone laughs at it, right? You would think like there's something's ethically off about them, right? But taking pleasure in something that is funny is both pleasurable and an ethical assessment, a real world ethical assessment of the social and ethical facts in that scene. So that's how he, I think, synthesizes the two. And I would just add, he couldn't do this if he didn't have a theology that allowed for the world to be real, alongside Shiva's unity being real. Appearances are also real. I think that is what allows this kind of synthesis to happen for him.
Okay. So Mahimabata, as you say, interestingly, although he was a Shaiva, employed or many of his ideas were formed by Buddhist thinking, particularly that of Dharmakirti. Can you just, give us a sort of brief overview of that without getting too far into the weeds?
So basically the idea is that Rasa is not evoked or hinted at. The reader infers. They use a process of inference so that you just infer what the character must be experiencing. So it doesn't say that she's sad, but because you have an experience in the world, you have a knowledge of how the world works, you infer that she's sad. And the theory of inference that he uses is drawn entirely from this Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti. And he had the option of drawing inferential theories from traditions like Nyaya, which are, more sort of commonly thought of as quote unquote Hindu. They accept the validity of the Vedas, at least. But he doesn't do that. he goes to this Buddhist, and the theory, the project for me really grew out of trying to figure out why. I mean, the project really originally was like, why is this guy who's not a Buddhist spending so much time quoting Dharmakirti? And I was never satisfied with the kind of, like, a lot, people who didn't have an answer to that question would just kind of give me this hand wavy. They'd be like, well, he just likes it, or like, oh, that was just, it was a good theory, so he just uses that theory, right? And I was just kind of always dissatisfied with that. So I was like, no, I mean, like, he takes this stuff seriously. He was clearly a religious person, and we know that from offhand references throughout his text. He's a religious philosopher, and if he's going to quote Dharmakirti that much, there must be something to say about why he's doing it, other than just like, well, whatever, he's just doing it. I don't know why, he just likes it.
That sounds like a kind of more modern, methodology, right? Just like grab bag, whatever theoretical devices work for your overarching argument. I mean, that's a very sort of modern, almost like academic approach.
Theorists in this tradition could borrow across religious lines. That was something that was done, but they wouldn't do it just totally thoughtlessly or without any sense of what that means for their own religious tradition.
So you never became satisfied, but do you have any sort of speculative theories about what he was trying to do there?
Yeah, I think that he is... I think that he's trying to... I think he's trying to do a number of things. One of the things I think he's motivated by is a rejection of the incorporation of Bhartrhari into Shaivism. And Bhartrhari is really, as I mentioned, at the core of what Anandavardhana is doing, and also, for very elaborate reasons, at the core of what Abhinavagupta is doing. And Mahimabata rejects that. And when he rejects that, literature becomes something very valuable and important, but not directly tied to the essence of the universe. And Dharmakirti is a philosopher who's very useful, I think, for breaking that direct connection between poetry and God, and for explaining how it is that poetry can be useful even though it's just an illusion. Dharmakirti has because for Buddhists, we operate in the world under all sorts of illusions, and sometimes they're useful in terms of being able to help us get what we want. And Mahimabata adopts that to sort of explain why, even though, for example, the emotion is not really there in the character the way it appears to be. Like there's not really a character who's sad. It's an illusion, but it's a useful illusion. Makes us happy, and it teaches us ethical lessons. And I think that Dharmakirti just works better for that project than any other philosopher he could have used.
Okay, so let me just try to peel this away a little bit more. I know you're kind of explaining it, but I just want to sort of understand. So he's resistant to adding this another dimension of meaning, this evocation. He doesn't want to admit that essentially Dhvani happens. And he characterizes it instead. He says it's just another species of inference, right? Mm-hmm. But how does he, because I think we understand, inference is this faculty of, or like this means of knowing. I know that there's a fire on the hill because there is smoke, blah, blah, blah. But there's something, phenomenologically quite different, right, about this kind of cumulative mood or temperament or whatever that happens as a result that emerges from, some kind of temporal sequence in the play or the work of art. And that feels very different than inferring something, right? So I'm
So
curious how he kind of
I'll ask you.
explain. Is it that he broadens our sort of understanding of what inference is, so that it can accommodate that, or is he actually trying to say that that experience is different than you think it is?
Yeah, I think he broadens the picture of inference a little bit. I'm not sure that he broadens it unduly. Like the Buddhist philosophy where this comes from is kind of similar to modern analytic philosophy in that it chooses the simplest possible examples. So the example you picked was the fire on the mountain. You see smoke on the mountain. You have experienced before that smoke is caused by fire, so you know that there must be fire on the mountain even though you can't see it. And that's the kind of like most rudimentary form of how inference works. But in reality, the practice of inference can get much more complex than that. And you can be performing multiple layered inferences at once based on, especially when it comes to human beings. We have so much experience about exactly what kinds of facial expressions signal what kinds of emotions and what kinds of emotions go with other kinds of, so like, oh, they didn't quite smile as much as I expected, and maybe they're upset about something. If they're upset about something, maybe it's because that thing that I said, that must have been a bigger deal than I thought, which means that they actually do like this person. Like we're capable of doing stuff like that. That is, much more complex than just there's fire on the mountain. And I think that what Mahimabata is saying is that poetry is a kind of like the full flex of that ability. I mean, he doesn't go for like he just kind of says. So the question is, okay, if I infer that my sister is sad, it's going to make me sad. But if I infer that Rama is sad, it's pleasurable. Like why the difference? And all Mahimabata says is like when you it has to do with the fact that it's not real, and it has to do with the fact that you're doing the work of inferring it. So actually, that's not that my sister's a bad example. Why is it so much pleasurable? Why is it so much more pleasurable? Okay, so literature is not real, so that enables certain things. But why is it important that the mood is inferred rather than just presented to us? He says, well, we just like things when we've inferred them ourselves. We just like them better. And it's a kind of like mute. What he could do, if you wanted to sort of revive the theory, is you could develop like a whole theory of play that's different from Abhinavagupta's, that's similar to what a modern theorist like David Graeber would have, which is sometimes we just enjoy exercising our abilities. Like if we can do something well, it's very pleasurable to do it. And inference is a process that we use all the time. We're quite good at it, and humans are quite social animals. We're quite good at inferring what other people are thinking and feeling. I mean, not good enough lots of times, but we're quite good at it relative to other animals. So we like doing it. So it's very pleasurable to do it because it's something we can do, and we like doing everything. Even the smallest creatures, they enjoy doing things that they can do, and we can do that. Mahimabata doesn't say that, but he could. I think that'd be compatible with his theory.
So James, who's right? What do you prefer as I think I can infer who you prefer, but tell us a little. What do you find more compelling?
Can you infer it, or has it been manifested over the course of this conversation? That's the question.
I think inference work. I think inference works there. I don't know about the overall vibe that I'm getting from you, and the enjoyment and pleasure I'm taking from this conversation feels like of a difference in kind. It's like categorically distinct from inference. That's how it feels anyway.
Yeah, I think that I have much more of an affinity for Abhinavagupta's theory. I think it can explain more of what's going on with literature. It's more true to life. It's more sophisticated. Mahimabata is interesting to me sociologically and historically. Um, the theories themselves are a little less interesting to me. Um, but I did, towards the end of my project, I had a kind of moment of real kinship with Mahimabata because I reread the opening verses and the colophon of the text, the very final thing, and you suddenly realize that he's like so openly humble and unsure of himself in a way that you rarely see in South Asian philosophers. He says at the end of the text, he says like, I've written this set of ideas that are totally new, and I'm sure it's going to go down in history. Whether that's because people find it hilariously stupid, or whether because it's really smart, I don't know which one it is, but it's going to be one of the two things, Um, and he says that he wrote the text sons and like yeah, he has this kind of human side to him that's quite delightful, I think.
And also sort of like kind of must be an interesting moment to think that you are partly responsible for that, projection of his imagination, that he's going to be known in the future through the work of James D. Reich and friends.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, right.
So, so I'm curious, kind of in obviously one of the beautiful things about studying and learning about intellectual history is that we want to be true to the historical context and try to closely understand what was happening there as much as possible. But then there's also just like being able to have new ideas that we can sort of discover or extract from time periods, because obviously our contemporary moment needs some new ideas. So I'm curious how you feel about what kind of some fresh perspectives are that we learn from these traditions that can be applicable, whether to, I don't know, philosophy, literary theory in general, or I don't know, even to, popular culture in some ways. Like, what do we kind of learn by like grappling with these literary theories?
Well, yeah. So one thing we learn that I think is important in the context of the Western Academy is like there were really, really sophisticated and interesting debates in Indian history. Like that's one thing that I don't think we should discount. I think that's actually quite important, and a lot of people still don't know. Sometimes I tell people, like at parties, I'm like, oh, I study Indian literature and philosophy and religion, and people say, oh, that's so specific. Like, it's actually enormous. It's like way more than enough for like 10 lifetimes.
It's actually quite general.
It's actually quite vague. I don't say that at conferences because it's way too vague of a thing to say to my colleagues.
I know in the Indology seminar, there was something you said that kind of someone said once that during the graduate Indology seminar that we would have on Tuesdays, someone spoke about how it's essentially like, having a seminar for like all of Western civilization. And then, all these people are supposed to kind of come together and find shared ground on something so vast. But each one of the people there is like focusing on a research project that is obviously so distinct, and there's very little overlap in many cases.
Yeah. And simply realizing how vast and complex history is, and also I think, this is a whole separate conversation. I think particularly for Americans, realizing that history is still going on and that we're in it is a very edifying and important experience. But that doesn't quite answer your question. You're asking more about like the content of the theories. I think that the idea that literary theories are not innocent is important with respect to your really, really deep commitments. I think everybody has this, but they don't often think about it or articulate it. Like, why do you think literature is valuable? Why do you think it's dangerous if it goes? Why do you think that? If you were a parent, why would you maybe not read certain books to your kids when they're young? Like all these kinds of things. Like, that's very tied to very, very deep ideas you have. And Abhinavagupta's ideas, even if you don't think that they're correct about like Shiva and the nature of Shaivism, the nature of the Shaiva universe, it's a really interesting way to think about what pain is, what pleasure is, what it is to be an individual, what it is to lose your individuality, what it is to feel a moment of kinship with an author. Because for Abhinavagupta, it's very much the case that the actual content of the author's mind is sort of coming alive again in your heart. Yeah, I think all those ideas for me have been, ideas that have stuck with me that I think about a lot in my day-to-day life.
Yeah, I can really relate to what you're saying. So I feel like you were onto something quite interesting when you were talking about kind of the value of studying these moments in intellectual history. So maybe I'll put the question this way as kind of as we round out the conversation. When you teach at university, you teach students. When you're trying to kind of make the case, if presuming you do in some sense, when you're trying to sort of instill some passion and curiosity around studying these traditions of philosophy or literary theory or religious ideas, how do you pose that in terms of like the value of studying these things? Like what's the value of studying some ancient texts and traditions?
Here's an idea of Mahimabata's that I think is relevant to contemporary life. I'm just thinking of this now, so I might take this back next week. But this is just sort of occurring to me in the course of this conversation. Those kinds of experiences of the deep value of the value of studying history, for example, they have to be sugar-coated. So with students, I could browbeat them about like, oh, this will expand your mind and this will make, but they really won't hear it. It's not until you actually show them an idea that they really are invested in, like, look, Abhinavagupta thinks that pain is pleasurable. Have you ever taken pleasure in pain? Why? And then they'll start to have ideas about it, or like ideas about inference, these kinds of things. And you have to sort of feel the joy of like the idea first, and then in retrospect you can say like, wow, that was actually really valuable. And then all sorts of, but if you just start out by sort of lecturing them on like, this will deepen you as a person, why should they believe you until they see it themselves? It's true, but it's hard to see until you experience it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, when I even think about my own kind of, what evoked the joy of learning. I mean, it really was these moments of just, the joy of a new idea. And it wasn't, somebody could say, this is valuable until they're blue in the face. But like you said, unless you experience, to me, like there are moments when, just encountering a new idea that completely shifted the orientation of my thinking on something, that is like, it's euphoric, and it makes me think, is that sort of, go ahead.
Well, it's one of the things that's so frustrating trying to defend the humanities, because people want, what's the value of this? And it's like, there is one, but if I just tell it to you, it's no fun. It has to be sugar-coated or evoked or something like you really have to taste it yourself, and then you'll see. But if you haven't tasted it, there's nothing I can say that will satisfy you. Except for really lame things like, oh, if you learn about the causes of the French Revolution, it will help you prevent another revolution, which is bullshit. Like, that's not how studying history works. It's not that simple. It's not that crude or mechanical. But yeah, it makes it really hard to defend the humanities, because you have to see for yourself, I think.
Yeah, that's so true. I think also, when I think back on the teachers that I've had, it's it's really the passion more than anything that, I mean, when you witness someone just geeking out and finding so much joy in the study of something, which you don't always find in academics, there is just that's contagious. That is a contagious kind of enjoyment that I think always has been, it's like a kind of transmission almost that you get from experiencing someone else's sort of intellectual joy.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm thinking, like, I wonder if there's a way to deepen our understanding of Mahima's sugarcoating theory by thinking about this stuff. But that's a conversation for a different day.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk to you a little bit. Maybe you can give us briefly, because actually I thought this was very interesting, although I forget the contents of the chapter. But the pragmatic use of illusion was one of your this chapter 6, Mahimabata's conception of literary being, and is that sort of what we're talking about? Like the sugar-coated, it's like it's an illusion, but it's useful because it's going to allow for, it's pragmatic because it's going to communicate these ethical values. Is that essentially the idea?
Well, yeah, well, that's his idea, yeah. It doesn't translate well to these humanities discussions because in this case, I don't think it is an illusion.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in a way, it's indirect in a way. So, you say like studying history is actually really valuable, but I can't just tell you that. So instead, I have to elicit your interest in this other thing that isn't that, and you think that what you're doing is that, but actually, I've got this much deeper project to try to like build you up as a person and make you more like empathetic to, I don't know, for example, like the decisions that people in leadership positions have to make under pressure without knowing where those decisions will lead. Like that's one of the things that's interesting to me about studying history is like watching people make decisions under constraint. You know, you can learn that, but you'll think, you know, I can teach you that, but I have to do it by pretending that I'm teaching you like other stuff. I don't know if that's exactly how I would describe my work in the classroom, but if I was going to try to square it with Mahima, that would be the way to do it.
Wow. Well, this has been really interesting, James. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I'm curious so obviously, again, we've been talking about the content of, you know, a book that you wrote 3 years ago now. Where has your intellectual adventure taken you since then? And what are you exploring at the moment?
Yeah, so I just published an article with a colleague of mine, Ben Williams, that continues to explore some of this Abhinavagupta stuff. So I've done that, but I have two other broader projects that I'm pretty excited about that are still kind of inchoate. One is an exploration of how motifs around songs and singing within Sanskrit literature, how songs and singing appear in Sanskrit literature. Because one of the things I would like to do is explore a little more carefully what aesthetic theories poets themselves are working with rather than just theorists. Because poets themselves often have elaborate ideas about all the stuff we've spent the last hour and a half talking about. So that's one thing. And the other thing is I've been exploring the history of gemstones in South Asia.
Wow, that's interesting.
Because of this example that I mentioned of the expert jeweler, who can determine whether a gem is genuine but can't tell you how. It's an idea that appears all across Indian philosophy and is used in all sorts of different ways. And there's a material history behind it. Those experts were actually real people who would sort of referee precious gem markets. So I'm kind of like trying to explore how the example is used and who the people behind that example really were. That's my other project.